and diplomacy, right? So in diplomacy, for example, if you look at the 140, 50 now, odd member states of the United Nations, maybe about 30 to 40 are OECD. That's the Organization of Economically, Developed Countries. The remaining tend to be governance deficit countries. So, small things like diplomacy, just visit diplomacy, tends to get very important for them because you have to substitute activity for achievement, and people don't realize this. So one of the things the government did was to send the prime minister and the president abroad very, very regularly, so that the quota had been met. So they've been slowly taking incremental steps. I can also get into defense what all they did, but they've been taking incremental steps slowly to fix things properly. The problem, however, has been that, in India, we tend to look at policy in silos. कि भाई अगर मेरे को defense fix करना है, I have to only look at defense. Or if I want to look at diplomacy, the only thing I have to do is to increase the number of diplomats we have. So right now we have around 600 diplomats. About 4 or 5 years back, we had 760 diplomats. And even though all the recommendations were that you need to expand the diplomatic service, they've actually made the diplomatic service even smaller. Now, this is a very linear approach. Agar ye X, Y, Z karoge, to you will get 2 plus 2 equals 4. The issue is policy is extremely intersectional. So, a lot of the solutions that you're looking for don't actually lie direct, even though there are some solutions that are direct. A lot of it is, in fact, you have to draw from other things, and I'll explain how. So you take your diplomacy for the time being. 600 is the approximately 600 plus is your strength. It is less than the diplomatic corps of Singapore. Imagine a tiny state, just a city really, with 4 million people, has more diplomats than India, and they have fewer embassies abroad than India. And this is the way things work. Now, the reason that this was done was because everybody who gets into the foreign service today gets to be an ambassador, which is basically a joint secretary level. Now, anybody who's done management will tell you that that's never a good idea. You can never have a square organizational structure. It has to be a pyramid where you keep culling out people according to their abilities or lack of abilities, till only the very best reach the top. Today, you don't have that. The second issue is education, right? Remember, when the IFS was set up, most of the people joining at that time, India was 10% urban, 90% rural at independence. And what used to happen was, much like the lords and ladies of England, the Indian Foreign Service was staffed with the children of extraordinarily rich people, Maharajas, and things like that. There's so many Kunwars and Rajkumars and things like that used to be in your foreign service, or they were British educated kids of extremely rich people. Since then, what has happened is, since the economic reforms of 1991, what you've seen is that there's been a massive rural to urban shift of population and a transformation of your cities. So your city institutions, which were made for quality, have been swamped by quantity. And the net result is that your intake has consistently been of people who are upwardly mobile, but they are not provided the kind of education that is required. Now, when you're the son and daughter of a Maharaja, you've traveled very widely. You've gone to the finest schools. You know how to hold your fork. You know how to charm people. You know how to insult people. You know how to spy on people. You know how to extract information from people across different classes of society and things like that. But when your parents were day laborers, you've suddenly come into the city, and this is a huge social climb for you. You are not trained to do things like that. And the problem is that our education syllabus for our diplomats hasn't kept in pace with the change in demographic of the intake into your Indian Foreign Service. So this is proving to be a major problem. One of the things that keeps happening is that every time I go abroad, people tell me, look, your bureaucrats just give us attitude. They're not willing to listen to us, right? Or they're socially graceless. For example, I'm not going to tell you which country, but I'd gone to meet this deputy prime minister of the country, and there was this naval officer with him. The naval officer was the liaison for the Indian embassy. And when we were coming out of the office, he was telling me, what's wrong with your ambassador here? She called me out for a discussion. And normally, when you take a diplomat out for a discussion, you take them to a very nice place where you can sit down, you become friends, and then you pump each other for information. She calls him out to McDonald's. And this is a country that's renowned for its food. So the insult of taking somebody to a McDonald's never sank in. The social gracelessness of it never sank in. These sound like small things, but they actually end up becoming huge issues. Now let's extrapolate this, and this I'm just giving you one example. Let's extrapolate this to defense. What is happening is you're having the same educational problem, but remember, it actually gets much more compounded in defense. Now, how many of you here grew up with either a PlayStation or an Xbox? Is there any way we can do a show of hands? No, maybe not. Okay. Now, what happens is mostly your intake in the military is from blue collar families. And here, even a reasonably well to do family will think 4 or 5 times before buying an Xbox or PlayStation for their kids. Not to mention how expensive the games are, because each one, if I recollect correctly, costs about $60, $70 every new game to put into it. So what happens is you have an entire generation that's grown up with a tactile knowledge of mobile phones, but not of playing games, which can process huge amounts of information. Now, when I was a young guy, we used to have those horrible old huge box computers. And the only games we could play, I don't even know if you'll know these games. They were called Dig Dug, Pac-Man, Space Invader, and Bricks. And you had 3 lives, and the situation was very clear in front of you, and that was it. It was very little information to process, and it was basic hand-eye coordination. Today, when I look at these games, the amount of information you have to process, the complications in them, they are just incredible, but they're made very simple for you. I mean, they're deceptively simple displayed on the screen. So one of the things that's happening is, because we're not taught these things, or at least the intake into the military doesn't have this kind of neuro-linguistic training from a young age, we're seeing it affects their ability to use technology quite significantly. The next big change that's happened is when you look at a platform like, say, the Rafale or the I don't know, the F-16 or what have you, they are just the tip of the iceberg, right? The 99% of the work is actually done in intelligence, where um, you identify the target, you time your strike precisely, and you can do a correct battle damage assessment ki bhai hit hua hai ya nahi hua hai. Now, it was very curious, of course, that Abhay brought up the Pulwama strikes and our response to it at Balakot, because one of the problems was that after Balakot, we weren't able to provide convincing proof that we'd actually hit a target. And with Pakistan, the one thing is that if you don't humiliate them publicly and decisively, they just pretend nothing happened. I mean, this is the one country that can pretend it never lost Bangladesh, or lost or had 93,000 troops taken prisoner of war and things like that. So I know it looks bad PR, but it's more than just PR, because if you aren't able to collect accurate information that you can analyze on what you have hit, you have to keep going back and hitting the same target 2-3 times, which becomes highly problematic, because it's a waste of ammunition, it's a waste of time, it's endangering the same pilots 3-4 times over just to get that one target, and it's very problematic. Your intake also, because in the military is largely blue collar, people aren't looking at things like, say, food security, or health, because 45% of your population is malnourished. Out of that, 33% is stunted, which causes significant disabilities in growth. Now, when I was in North Korea, it's very easy to see that people are stunted. It never hits you, but you suddenly see this whole army of midgets, what you think are midgets, coming up to you. They're 4 feet 6 inches or something like that, fully grown people, but 4.5 feet and things like that. And you're like, what happened here? And it turns out that their growth was stunted because they were born during the famines that hit North Korea. You never realize this till you see the Bihari landless laborer working at construction sites in Delhi. And if you notice, they are all under 5 feet, right? Which is very, very scary. That's when you realize that you have a stunting problem. It takes, you read about this, but it never really hits you till you see it. Now, this is the same people that are getting absorbed into your military, at least at the fighting levels. Some even at the officer level, but mostly at the fighting levels. And there's a fundamental, if you have this much stunting, then you have a fundamental problem with both malnourishment and stunting, is that your cognitive abilities get impaired, which makes your ability to take decisions, your ability to absorb information, highly complex. So, what we're seeing with this government is there's a lot of direct solving of problems, but that intersectional, interdepartmental solving of problems simply isn't happening. So I'm going to leave it out there. I know it's a very stark picture, but of course, I don't think Abhay and Vinayak would have called me if they wanted some optimistic buck up kind of speech. They call me because I'm an eternal pessimist. So I'll leave this now to questions and answers, and you can feel free to ask me anything. I just focused on something very specific, but feel free to ask me anything outside of what I've spoken as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And this, sir, is out of pure respect, sir. I must say. Thank you so much for joining us today and making this webinar an interesting one and thought-provoking one. We will now have the Q&A session in which we will have we have collected few questions which people wanted to ask you.
Cool.
And the first one is regarding this polarization on Twitter.
Hmm.
So they have this very. Why do you think that there's so much polarization of opinion on social media platforms like Twitter, and how does they affect the real news or the real facts present?
Um, could you just ask me that question again? I don't think I understood it completely.
Yes, sir. So the question is that what do you think about the polarization of the extreme, that two different, totally different views of social media platform like Twitter, and how does they affect the real news in it?
Okay. So the thing is, we have noticed that the earliest we noticed this kind of the internet's ability to create extremes, to polarize, was started with Al Qaeda. When the internet first started gaining ground, Al Qaeda had a first mover advantage. And what used to happen was, if you had individuals in a village who said, I want to go kill kafirs and things like that, they would be the freak. The rest of the village will say, और कोई काम नहीं है क्या तेरा, जाके कुछ बीज बो या do some खेती बाड़ी and things like that. But what happened with the internet is that this freak, or whatever you want to call him, finds lots of people exactly like him in another city, or another town or another village, whatever, and they create an online community. And a lot of Al Qaeda's initial recruitment that happened was based on this. So, what the internet does, and things like social media especially do, of course, social media is overt. What Al Qaeda did on the deep net was covert, is that you find similar people. So Abhijit Iyer Mitra on Twitter will find people who are similar. The people who follow him will have a kind of similar thinking. And you form these micro communities on Twitter. It's almost like creating your own village or creating your own town or creating your own city, depending on how many followers you have. And then what happens is, it is always the extremes that end up hijacking the debate. Because I think if you've all read Nicholas Nassim Taleb, you'll see that uh, in a general community, 90% of the people really don't give a damn. It's the 10% who give a damn who are the extremists, and they give enough of a damn to want to seize the narrative, to want to seize the policy opportunities and things like that. And so they do. And then the remaining 90% are essentially forced to follow them. Right. So what happens is, on one hand, the internet creates these very potent little micro communities. On the other, it tends to aggregate them. Agar tum left ho, have you seen, has anyone noticed that ever since social media came, there is no more center left? There is only very far left and even further left, and very far right and even further right. Centrists are almost impossible to come across. And if you are a centrist, you're called either Paltu or Dal Badlu or traitor or whatever, or things like that. So this is a sort of, there's no going back on this, because it's also, democratized the discourse to the point where you're back to the Greek agora stage, the Athenian democracy stage, where everybody gets a vote. And if you remember, one of the first most famous things that the Athenian democracy did was to condemn Socrates to death by drinking hemlock. So there are these dangers of extreme democratization. There are the dangers of social media. We know this. But it's now out of the bottle and there's nothing you can do about it. Nothing, a lot of good has come from it, but a lot of dangers also lurk. And I think more dangers than good, possibly. But there's no way you can put the genie back in the bottle now that it's out.
Okay, thank you, sir. Now, next question is, I think Vinayak will ask the next question.
Thank you, sir. So the next question is, how can we address the misinformation war, also called the fake news war, which is harming India? In the current sense, if we go through the Shaheen Bagh protests or the farmers' protests or any other protest or issue related to the government or citizens, India has been facing fake news since some time. So how can we address this issue?
So there's two ways of doing it. One is to have extremely accurate information, which comes from investing in human beings. Right? You have to invest time and you have to invest in human beings, because that builds up quality, quality, quality. The second is, remember, respectability is a function of ecosystem. For the amount of fake news that New York Times and Washington Post peddle, they should not be considered respectable newspapers. And yet they are. When the New York Times, or was it the Washington Post, ran Imran Khan's article about Kashmir, what was India's response to it? We got the Indian ambassador in Washington to go around begging the same newspaper to run his counter to it. Why do you want to do that? The point is to discredit that newspaper and say that this is a third rate rag, it's not worth writing for, and instead go to somebody like Fox News. So, you have to create an ecosystem where you keep saying that, dekho bhai, who are these speakers here? So there's Abhay, Amrita, Anisha, Avichal. Okay? So I'm sorry, I'm just picking you at random. So assume that Anisha and Avichal are left wing. And Anisha works with the New York Times, Avichal works with Washington Post, whereas Amrita works with Op India and Abhay works with Swarajya. What you do in circumstances like this is you completely ignore Anisha and Avichal. You only give interviews to Abhay and Amrita, and you say, Bhai, dekho, what Anisha and Avichal write aren't even worth the paper that they're written on. You say it publicly. So you keep signaling that you're not willing to talk to them because their views aren't worth anything. But the problem here is that Abhay and Amrita also need to up their game. So it's a very complex mix of human investment and creating an ecosystem. The problem right now is with the right wing, we crave the left's approval so much that they're willing to be judged by them. I can tell you how many people on the right literally crave that thing from Ramchandra Guha. But they won't crave the same thing from, say, Makrant Paranjpe or something like that. Why? So, there's a fundamental inferiority complex out here. And the second is our platforms like, say, Republic or Times now. They scream too much. You don't have a calm sit down conversation because that isn't what gets you the hits. So you have to be willing to set up channels that don't get too much popular hits, but still give you quality content. And that's not happening because there's no focus on creating an ecosystem. There's no focus on willing to make this work, even though it's not profitable. So again, it's a complex problem set, and it's not being sorted out. That's how you combat fake news, basically.
Okay, thank you, sir. Sir, the next question is regarding a diplomacy question. So what are your views on the change in leadership in the US and how it will affect the diplomatic relation between the two countries, India and US? Because Donald Trump and Joe Biden have the kind of opposite views on different things. So how will it affect the diplomatic relations?
Uh, the hope is that it won't affect too much. Unfortunately, the reality probably is slightly different. It depends on how the local embassy starts telegramming information back to DC. I can tell you during Trump's time, all the diplomatic cables that were going from the embassies here were factual. Whereas if your diplomatic service had depended exclusively on reading Indian newspapers or the Washington Post and New York Times, it would have been a very different negative picture that would have gone back. Now, the problem here is, what kind of people do they depute to the embassy in Delhi? And what kind of people do they put in charge of India at the State Department in DC? If it's going to be people that are very, very partisan and aligned towards this sort of wokeism and liberalism and so on and so forth, you have a huge, huge, huge problem at hand, because the toxicity is going to set in slowly. It never happens overnight, it happens very, very slowly. And we've already seen how Biden is willing to punish countries that he felt supported Trump during the election campaign. Right. So the Saudis have been punished in that the Houthi rebels in Yemen have been delisted as terrorists. The UAE has been punished in that the export of F-35 fighters to it has been stopped. India has not yet been punished, but there are signs on the horizon that it may get punished. And this is sort of also in the broader scope of things, that when we talk about shared values, India's belief in shared values of democracy and free speech is very similar to what the American belief in free speech was in the 80s, not what it's evolved to in the 2010s and 2020s, which includes hate speech and muzzling speech that hurts people. All right. So this is now getting very problematic, because if there's a Republican administration, you'd find that the Indian and American values will more or less be aligned. If you have a Democrat administration, you will find that those views will always face a great deal of tension, and this isn't new. Normally, conservative governments in Australia and conservative governments in America have had a very good relationship. But if Australia has a conservative government and America does not, there tends to be tension in that relationship. It's the same with Democrat presidents and Tory prime ministers in the UK. There's a whole lot of academic literature on this. You can go look it up. And it's not surprising that it's going to happen in India as well. If you remember with the NSG, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, uh, a Republican, George Bush, was willing to go the extra mile for India, but for the IAEA exception to India. But when it came to NSG membership, Barack Obama wasn't willing to go that extra mile. Right. So there's always been this sort of mismatch between which ideology rules in which country. Right now, it's quite safe to say that Democrats in general may not be the best thing for India, but they're not exactly bad for India, even though they're demonstrably bad for Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE.
Thank you, sir. Next question, Vinayak Bhaiya will take.
So, A question by Rinzin. What are your views on one China policy? Is it relevant?
So one China policy has always been the biggest disaster, ठीक है ना? And I'll tell you why. India seems to be more keen to enforce the one China policy than the Chinese themselves are. This is like the Red Guard coming and saying say long live Mao Zedong 10 times, and the Indians then saying long live Mao Zedong 100 times. It's actually quite shameful. So we tend to treat our Tibetan diaspora and the Tibetan leadership like disposable commodities. Jab statement karna hai, then give them an interview or something like that. Otherwise, ignore them and treat them like dirt. And treat them like dirt for absolutely no return from China or whatever. It's the same thing applies to things like Taiwan especially. Uh, my personal thing would be don't mess with India should deal with the one China policy the way China deals with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Officially, they've signed it, but in practice, they violate it every single hour of every single day. And that's what you need to do. You need to be having blatant, open conversations with the Taiwanese. You need to be setting up a full-blown Tibetan embassy out here, and have a Tibetan representative at every Indian diplomatic mission abroad and things like that. And keep saying yes, yes, yes. We support one China policy, and then go shake hands. Send the prime minister off on a private holiday to Taiwan or something like that. Formal compliance, informal absolute violation of the one China policy. That has to be the goal out here. Sadly, we won't do that because I'm not going to go into it why on a public forum. Let's just say that we're not as solid as we like to think we are. So I hope that answers your question, Rinzin. If you want to ask me anything specific as a follow-up, feel free to.
Yes, sir. Following up on this question only, sir, recently we heard that all the Galwan region tension and all the tension with China. So, sir, we have also heard that we hold different level of meetings with them. But, sir, with time they all fail. So it's a diplomatic issue that they fail, or it's something bigger than that, that all those meetings fail over time.
See, they succeed tactically, but they end up failing strategically. So Doklam for us was a huge victory tactically, but whatever we won at Doklam, we kind of squandered at the Wuhan summit. Right. My worry here is that we've again won a big victory and mind you, we have won a victory. This isn't ending a stalemate. It's because it's the first time in 70 years. The Chinese attitude has always been, jo mera hai, wo jo tumhara hai, wo bhi mera hai. This is the first time we've made land controlled by the Chinese negotiable. Because if you look at the area between finger 4 and finger 5 of Pangong Lake, that has been under Chinese occupation since 1998. They built a road right up to the tip of finger 4 and they effectively controlled it till last year. And we've kind of reversed that and made them move back almost to finger 6. So, it is a victory. The problem is what our military wins on the ground, our diplomats tend to squander. Notice the pattern here. This fear of not dealing with the one China policy, this fear, almost surrendering to China at the negotiating table. It becomes problematic. So yes, that is my fear that on one hand, your diplomatic service is compromised. The second is, this need to see a cause-effect relationship in whatever China does. And that's very dangerous because it's like, what's it called? Bashed wife syndrome or beaten wife syndrome, something. It's like that. A woman who is the subject of domestic abuse keeps looking within herself. मैंने क्या किया कि मेरे पति देव ने मेरे को मारा? Was it my fault? Was my food, did I put too much salt into the food? Was I not dressed properly? You know what? It's not her fault. Your husband is a piece of shit. Get used to it. So, stop looking. This other problem with us is we keep looking at ourselves. What have we done to upset the Chinese? You've done nothing. This is China's natural behavior. It always has been over the last 2000 years. When they are strong, they will go on the offensive. When they are weak, they will pretend that they're doing you a favor by giving you what is already yours. Okay, so never ever fall for that crap and never fall for the self doubt.
Thank you, sir. The next question is by Rajat. Is narrative building important for a nation to become powerful, or should we do our work and leave it to the world to judge?
Narrative building is extremely important. Now, there is soft power, which is separate from narrative building. Soft power, if you look at it, if you look at foreigners looking at India, they've got a wide basket to choose from, right? It's like that toolkit said, it's the land of chai and yoga, of beautiful elephants, of Holi and this and that, which are very endearing, and then this so-called fascism that's coming in, which is not endearing. However, and so it's a technicolor palette. It's multicolored, so you can choose. You can pick and choose what you like. You can pick and choose what you don't like. The thing about China is it's just black and white. It's you take what the Chinese government tells you is soft power and you ignore everything else. The issue with narrative building is required irrespective of which side of the technicolor or monochrome spectrum you're on, because that is how a nation projects itself onto the outside world. So narrative building also involves a bit of coercion of the foreign press, co-option of the foreign press, denying people. So for example, this chap Jagmeet Singh, who's now supporting Justin Trudeau's government in parliament, till 3 4 years back, he was treated as a VIP. He was coming to India every single day. He owns property in India. He was going to the Golden Temple every day. Uska property seize karo na. Take away his OCI card. He doesn't have an OCI card. He comes on a visa. Stop that. You need to be proactively identifying these people and stopping that. So there are two important parts of narrative building. One is creating a story. Two is uh, making life very difficult for people who don't go along with that story. Now, you can't do this to Indians because Indians have a right to free expression, but you can do it to foreigners, and you should be doing it to foreigners. We don't. And that becomes very problematic. The third thing is actually tackling issues as and when they arise. Now, during the Selampur riots, during Shaheen Bagh and the Delhi riots that followed, during the uprooting of telephone poles, during the blockade of roads, at no point did the government actually come out, hold a briefing for the foreign press, and shoot down all their fake questions and things. Even during Kashmir, we didn't do it. So, that propaganda department simply isn't working. It isn't working at all. I mean, forget functioning badly, they're not functioning at all. And that becomes very problematic.
Thank you, sir. Sir, the next question is regarding the Finger 3 region. That why India sacrificed Finger 3 that was making India stronger against Chinese troops on northern side of the lake.
We have not
Why
sacrificed
India?
finger three. We have not. We who go right up to finger four, boss. Finger four, there's a place called Foxhole Point. It's a very sharp ridge that goes right into the lake itself. So we hold right up to finger four. We've always held up to finger four. There was the Battle of Sirijap. Finger four se shuru hota hai. Between finger four, 5 and 6 is Sirijap, and there was the Battle of Sirijap in 1962, and we fell back to finger four because that was the most easily defensible point, right? So we haven't fallen back at all.
That was a confusion then, sir, from our side. Sir, the next question is from Jitendra Sahu. That, sir, what do you think? What will be the future of Indian society? Do you think that India may face civil war in the coming decade as per the present situation of Indian society when caste and religion issues are becoming dominant in it? It's kind of a assumption, but still.
So no, surprisingly, I don't. You may have it if your economy continues growing at this pace. We need about 12 to 15% growth rates, like what China saw, to industrialize. You need hundreds of thousands of new jobs and things like that. Right now, civil war, no. Simply why? Because Most of our people aren't on social media. Look at the total number of people who watch TV. Even English TV at any given point of time is minuscule. It's about 10 to 12 million people. Look at the number of Indians on Twitter. It's about 18 million people. That's nothing in a country of 1.3 billion, as opposed to the sheer numbers of Americans who are on Twitter, that are on social media. America is much more likely to get into civil war than India is, right? India, backwardness is almost a gift for us in that sense, that 90% of our population isn't on social media. 90 to 95% of our population isn't even interested in news channels. They'd much rather be watching, the only time they'll turn on a news channel is when Riya Chakraborty gets arrested, or Sushant Singh Rajput gets dies, or when I don't know, when Rakhi Sawant does some jhumka or thumka or something like that. They're only interested in entertainment. And as far as politics goes, they're only interested in politics as long as the politician is entertaining. If they're not, they're really not interested in politics. So it's we're reasonably insulated that way. So no, कुछ नहीं होने वाला है. Civil war, don't worry about it. अभी नहीं होने वाला है.
All right, sir. The next question is by Dhruva. It's very known that Biden will raise CA issue and Kashmir issue, which will anger India. How you think India will counter it? And a supplementary to that, will we see major countries turn against the US and make America stand alone?
So to answer part one, he can keep raising CAA and Kashmir. It's really not going to affect anything, because if he asks questions, we'll answer it and we'll move on. Okay, sometimes you even have, like, for example, when we did our homework on the CAA, because we were all told, when we kind of knew 370 was going to go, and we were all told to go ferret out our sources in DC and see what they were going to say. And the standard answer was, look, we may issue some official statement, just ignore it, because in private, we're not going to do anything. So don't go by statements. Statements are what politicians put out so that they can avoid taking action on anything. Like they say, speech was invented so that man could hide his thoughts. It's like that. Diplomatic statements are made so that they don't have to take any action on it. Uh, so let's see. I will judge them more by their actions rather than their statements. They're free to make statements. It's not a big deal. On part two, and you don't need to counter it. You just say we've got a different interpretation of things. On part two, do you see many countries turning against the US? Actually, I do not. I do not see them turning against the US. Far from it. I think the Western alliance, despite all the predictions, is only going to keep getting consolidated more and more and more, the more they feel under threat from a rising East. So as of now, at least for the next 20, 30 years, and you never predict beyond the next 20, 30 years, it's impossible to do it. No, you do not see more countries turning against the US, no.
Thank you, sir, regarding that also. Sir, the next one is from Saurabh Mishra. Sir, do you think that this government has failed to counter the fake narratives by the leftist since Dadri case? Also, and I have this question addition to it, that sir, I have also seen this government fails in kind of a communication medium from its decision making table to the decision applicable application ground. So,
Yeah.
what are your views on it, sir?
Look, they mismanage communications very badly, boss. There's no doubt about it. But I think they sometimes do it deliberately, because they're brilliant at communicating with the Indian electorate. They're absolutely useless when it comes to communicating with the outside world. And I think they do it for a reason. In fact, I know they do it for a reason, because once when I asked a cabinet minister, why don't you shut down NDTV or things like that, he's like, भाई अगर हम एनडीटीवी और स्क्रोल और वायर को बंद करेंगे, तो लोग तो हमारे लिए वोट डालना बंद कर देंगे. So, they actually see, every time a foreign media house criticizes India, the amount of anger that erupts in India is just remarkable. So it creates that siege mentality. So I think they actually sometimes do this deliberately. It's good for them electorally, it's just not good for India as a nation. And I do think they're prioritizing their political objectives over. But it's almost undeniable. The more the Western press attacks India, the more India tends to grind its feet in.
All right, sir. The next question is from Prabhas. Can China be dealt with diplomacy only? Shouldn't we stop ideological infiltration, which is trying to divide India? And I have a
Absolutely. Yeah.
excuse me, sir. I have a supplementary to what Abhay had asked regarding the communication medium. According to you, where does the previous Vajpayee government stand, and where does the Modi government stand in terms of communicating or implementing various laws and regulations, and communicating the mandate for
Hmm.
which they had been voted to power? So, how do you judge both these, and how do you rank both
Look,
these?
I'm not going to get into policy delivery because I'm still not clear about what Modi promised. Though what Vajpayee promised used to be very clear, and it was delivered on very clearly. But in terms of managing the press, on if you mark them out of 10, I would give Vajpayee about 9, 9.5. I'd give Modi between 3.5 to 4. And I'll tell you why. Vajpayee saw this need very early. That is why he had Pramod Mahajan. Was it Pramod Mahajan? Wasn't it Pramod Mahajan?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes.
The
So
second man who used to sit behind him, na, in
correct.
parliament.
So Pramod Mahajanji, who used to every day there used to be a press conference, he was very combative. If you couldn't get away with bullshitting in his presence. So if you were a foreign correspondent or anything like that and you had any fake news, he had the power, he had the proximity to the prime minister to be able to demand uh, minutely updates, hourly updates from the relevant departments who wouldn't dare defy him. And this is a very important function of the press because remember, Manmohan Singh had Sanjay Abaru, but because Manmohan Singh himself was a weak prime minister, people would actually deny information to Sanjay Abaru. Whereas with Pramod Mahajan, everybody knew he wasn't to be messed around with because he was so close to the prime minister, and the prime minister was powerful in his own right. So he used to do a fantastic job with these things. You couldn't really carry fake news stories when he was in charge of those press conferences and things like that. So that was very, very good. Coming to part one of this question, which was China, well, it's a different question, but Prabhas's question. No. You simply, first of all, diplomacy won't work with China. Let's be absolutely clear about it. Everybody has tried diplomacy. China doesn't work like a normal country. uh, and we also tend to make this mistake thinking, I've heard this at IFS officers say this, and it's such complete rubbish. They'll tell you things like, normal people, we just tend to think in electoral timelines, 5 years or 4 years, depending on if you have American elections or Indian elections. Maximum you can think of 10, 15 years. But the Chinese think in timelines of 10,000 years and things like that. Such a load of crap. Such a load of absolute undiluted crap. Okay, you go to China, you see, when people actually mingle with ordinary people and policy in China as opposed to the official delegates of China, you'll see they're extremely confused, they're extremely divided about policy. There's so many factions vying for power within that government and things like that. So you never deal with China just with diplomacy. All diplomacy requires a certain element of economic warfare and military warfare always infused into it. There was this famous British diplomat who said, a diplomat is a person who is sent abroad to lie for his country, and that diplomacy is warfare by other means. So you combine the two and you get it. Diplomacy, unfortunately, in India, we've just tend to associate it with a lot of hot air balloons providing biogas on demand. That's not diplomacy. I know in India we consider that diplomacy. It is not diplomacy. It is merely the fusion point of where your military and economic needs intersect, and how well you can lie and hide your actual intentions.
Thank you, sir, for that one too. So also, sir, we have students here from the humanities background, and some of us also inspired to become a UPSC aspirants. So aside from it, you also work, you are also a senior fellow at the Nuclear Security Program at Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. So can you give us some insights regarding which all fields we can explore after graduation regarding these fields?
Right. So if you're planning on getting into the UPSC, what I'd suggest you do is try to focus, like I told you, on intersectionality of policy, interdisciplinary policy. And I'll tell you why. Because it won't matter which cadre you get, you will be shunted from one department to another. So you need to understand holistically how policy works. If you decide to focus just on nuclear and tomorrow they shift you to the department of food processing, what exactly are you going to do with being a nuclear specialist? काम नहीं करेगा ना. So that's not the way it works. What I'd suggest you do is do two things. One is try to be as interdisciplinary as possible, but choose one or two verticals where you get micro specialization. If you're good at what you do, usme career opportunities automatically aayenge. Now, UPSC you only go for if you are comfortable suppressing your personality and blending into the organization as a whole. Placing the amorphous bureaucracy over your own personality. If you've got a big personality, then the UPSC is not for you. And this is why my father retired as Additional Secretary Defense, my mom retired as Secretary Industries in Tamil Nadu, and they divorced when I was 5. The one thing they never agreed on anything, but the one thing they could agree on was that Abhijit Iyer Mitra is not made for the UPSC. Please do not join the UPSC. That was the one thing they both agreed on. And so even when I wanted to write the UPSC exam, they said, we are not helping you out in this. You are not going to write it and things like that. Best decision they ever took. I mean, they were spot on that. Why? Because I would have never blended in with being a sort of faceless babu. So always consider that. If you think you are going to make a change being part of the bureaucracy, you are not. Because I know several absolutely brilliant people within the bureaucracy who have been crushed by the overwhelming weight of mediocrity in those organizations. But if you think you can work in that environment, then by all means go ahead and do so.
So you just brought us down from cloud nine regarding UPSC now.
Good.
Because you brought us a very realistic image of what we mediocrity is very important in diplomat relations, and we all see that.
Yeah.
So, and regarding your job profile,
Hmm.
we can also go these institutes for further
Yes.
job application and
We have
career.
several think tanks. You can even make a career in academia itself. You don't even have to join a think tank that way. You can join universities, and there are lots of postgraduate fellowships, graduate and postgraduate fellowships available abroad that you can go for and get integrated into academia there. So if you choose to work in defense and foreign policy, there's a lot of options available to you. Government, outside government policy related, press and journalism, and the corporate sector. Because, when so much of the budget goes towards defense, working for defense companies in the corporate sector is one of the most rewarding things you can do. Unlike any other corporate sector, defense, the moment you join defense, it's all business class fares for you starting right from the entry level. So if you like to lead the high life, go join, I don't know, British Aerospace or Saab or something like that.
Okay, so there is one more question left in the chat box, and I think it would be the last question of the day. How far does this argument hold ground that Donald Trump lost power because he lost the war of narrative?
Uh, Not entirely. He didn't lose the war of the narrative that much, as he did. If you read the latest Time piece on what the Democrats did, they had a coordinated plan almost 1.5 years before the elections, where they knew how, where, and how they wanted to manipulate. And they went around challenging and changing the laws of those counties almost 1.5 years in advance. Okay, so it was one of those places where even a narrative change or winning the narrative war wouldn't have done much. And he probably was on his way to victory even in spite of these changes. I highly recommend that Time article. Please go read it. Uh, uh, but he would have won had it not been for COVID. COVID was what really destroyed his presidency. Like it would have anybody, because once the economy goes down, there's never been a president who's won when the economy has gone down. When the economy has tanked, no president of America has ever had a chance of re-election. So not happening. So it wasn't because of the narrative. In fact, with the narrative, you can say he won more votes than he won in the previous election. It's just that Biden won even more votes, and that was entirely because of mobilization. So the narrative, in fact, the more vicious people are against you, the more you tend to polarize your own supporters, as in accumulate more supporters. Like we saw with like that question on Modi. The more the foreign press attacks you, the more Indians tend to dig their heels in. It's the exact same way. The more the lefty press tends to attack you, the more your supporters dig their heels in. So it wasn't a loss of narrative, it was an economic loss and it was a structural loss. Okay, Rinzin has asked two questions. Shall I take those questions quickly before we
Yes, sir,
close
sure.
shop? Will Tibet get independence? Is it near or far? It will get independence at some point, because in the next 30, 40 years, China is heading the same way as the USSR. I don't know what will come of it. Okay. Will it be the whole greater Tibet? Will it just be the Tibet Autonomous Region or whatever? If China will accept a breakup like the USSR did, that it has a soft head like Gorbachev, or will it have a brutal, nasty fellow who will crush any, Fissiparous movements and things like that? Pata nahi. But China is already making a lot of the same mistakes the USSR did. And the second question, Rinzin, that you asked was how far Belt and Road Initiative is menacing Indian security and Tibetan independence. Rinzin, if you're worried about Tibetan independence, the Belt and Road Initiative, and if you're worried about India's security, the Belt and Road Initiative is the best thing that happened to Indian security, and it's the best thing that happened for Tibetan independence. Because I have never seen an economic project so completely lacking in economic sensibility, in proper costing, or in any kind. It is such a toxic, bad asset. To invest in the Belt and Road is to go invest in Kingfisher and Vijay Mallya. तो जो विजय माल्या को हुआ वही ये बेल्ट एंड रोड इनिशिएटिव को होने वाला है, because there is no profitability, boss. You show me, we've attended like 10, 12 track tours with the Chinese. We go to Beijing every year to talk to the Chinese at an official level. And every time we ask for a cost benefit analysis of, and we've been doing this for 10 years, cost benefit analysis of the Belt and Road Initiative. And, they keep changing the name. It's called first String of Pearls, then OBOR, and now BRI and whatnot. They never give you one. And then you point out the logical fallacies in it, the lack of economic sense in it. They just pretend that they're not getting it. And there's a very good reason that they're not getting it. And this is why we should thank Xi Jinping, that he has made all dissidents criminally punishable. So even disagreeing with the Belt and Road Initiative can get you into deep shit. So what's happened is, open channels of communication, they act as an early warning system. When something is going wrong, you're able to see it coming and change course. Here, because everybody's scared to talk about it in China, in private, they may even agree with you, but they won't dare say it out. So somewhere between his economic mismanagement and his terrorizing of society, of contrary views within society, not even dissent, just contrary policy views in society, he's kind of gone to the era of Brezhnev. And, Brezhnev and Khrushchev, between them, they set the stage for the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's exactly what Xi Jinping has done. Best of luck to him. I hope it succeeds. And
Sir,
when
I had a
you
question
should support it.
regarding Belt and Road. Sorry.
Bolo, Rajat.
Yeah. So, sir, like, do you really think that Belt and Road is for profit making? Because, for example, the what I think the main aim of China is to get these small nations into trap like Pakistan and Sri Lanka.
I completely accept that, Rajat. But see, what happens is when you get into a debt trap, this debt trap diplomacy where you would get annexed, invaded, and your economy would get taken over used to work just fine in the early 1900s. Between, say, 1850 to 1920, 1930, 1940, it used to work just fine. But in this day and age, if you renege on your debts, hota kya hai? Kuch nahi hota hai. Venezuela has reneged on all its debts. Has anybody gone invaded it or disrupted its national sovereignty? Nothing. Argentina went bankrupt. That those days when you can go annex people or subvert governments for bad debts is gone. When a debt goes bad today, it just goes bad. There's nothing you can do about it. Bas. ठीक है ना? So it's like if you default on a loan, you get jail. But if you declare bankruptcy, you can't be sent to jail. You get bankruptcy protection unless you've done something crooked. So in this case, if you go bankrupt, that's it. That's your investment wiped out. ठीक है ना? So this is I know in India we don't understand it so easily because even when somebody goes bankrupt, we like sending them to jail. But if you look at a solid bankruptcy, like Chapter 11 protections in America, if you go bankrupt and if you have not done any fraud, that's it. You're bankrupt. Paisa gaya. End of story. Boo hoo hoo. Deal with it. Start your next business.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, guys, I have to go now. No more questions.
If I may ask one question.
Yep.
Sir, what is your take on the audacity of some political leaders who said Pulwama attack was done by Narendra Modi to gain victory in 2019?
यार
And
देख देख भाई ये चूतिए लोग हैं इनका ये चूतिए लोगों का चूतिया आंसर मैं नहीं देने वाला ये I mean, why do you even get into these things? The conspiracy theories are never healthy, and it tells you a lot about the addled mind of these people. You shouldn't give it more traction.
correct, sir.
हाँ,
But
तो just ignore stupid questions like that.
these frivolous
Just
statements.
ignore the person who said that. Just ignore him. Do not take that person seriously. Full stop.
Yes, sir. And one last
सर ये पीओके और अक्साई चिन्ह कब आ रहा है सर भारत के फोल्ड में
नहीं आ रहा है boss.
Any
So we should also be realistic. When nuclear deterrence applies, you are not getting back 1 square inch of Aksai Chin. You are not getting back 1 square inch of Gilgit Baltistan or anything like that. You're free to daydream about it. But remember, like I said, this we were telling Rajat ki international finance has moved on. Similarly, international diplomacy has moved on. You don't wage war to gain territory anymore. It's just not done. If and when the collapse of China happens and things fall apart, is there a chance that then you may be able to make some hay? Yes, possibly you could. Ditto with Pakistan, but otherwise नहीं. ये ना ये ख्वाहिश अच्छे हैं बॉस कि मैं ना अगले जन्म में मैं सलमान खान की तरह लगूंगा और मेरे को ऐश्वर्या राय मेरी बीबी बनेगी, ऐसे चीजें. बट नेवर कंफ्यूज इट विद रियल लाइफ. Okay, reality is I'm sorry, I'm very out of date. आजकल handsome actor कौन है बॉस? I only remember when I was a kid. I haven't seen a Hindi movie in a long time. आजकल अच्छा actor कौन है? You get the drift. You get the drift. ठीक है? These are all fantasies. These going, grabbing land, waging war for land. These are all outdated notions. Nobody does it anymore. Plus, there's nuclear deterrence. So that was the last question. Shall we move on? Khatam?
Yeah, sure, sir.
Yes, sir.
Just a vote of thanks.
Okay.
So thank you so much, sir. It was a very great session and it was very entertaining, and you explained the things very easily. So we get that, and we are moving forward to to see you on campus in Kirodimal College soon when the pandemic ends and college opens.
Thank you so much, Charchit. I hope I come there and don't get lynched by some lefty lynch mob, because the last time we tried even so I know when you asked me to share this on Twitter. And the reason I didn't is because the last time I did it was at Jindal University, and the entire event got hacked by a lefty crowd. So I didn't want the same thing happening here, इसीलिए मैंने शेयर नहीं किया है. अगर मैं उधर आ जाऊंगा पूरा दंगा फसाद हो जाएगा और मैं उआपा लगा के मेरे को भी जेल में डाल देंगे फिर से एक और बार किसी और चीज के लिए. तो let's see.
Sir,
But thank
this
you
is
so
not
much.
going to
Very
happen
kind.
this time. Sir, right is getting stronger.
Hopefully.
So thank you so much, sir.